ability to be able to ask questions during, but we won't be dealing with them until the end of the presentation. So I hope that works. We're doing our best to navigate these uneasy waters. So on that basis, I'd like to introduce Professor Gordon Noble from the Department of Archaeology at the University of Aberdeen. He's been at the department since July 2008 and was made professor in 2019. So congratulations on that. I hope that works. We're doing our best. Gordon's undertaken landscape research and directed field projects across Scotland. So on that basis, he's worked on a wide range of landscapes and archaeology projects from the Mesolithic to the medieval period. He was director and co-founder of Strathearn and Royal Fortified, acronym SERF, that's SERF, a successful archaeological project researching a site that became one of Scotland's early royal centres. He now works on two major projects, firstly Northern Picts, which is focused on the post-Roman societies of northern Britain, and secondly Comparative Kingship, which is examining the early royal landscapes of Ireland and Scotland. Gordon's also worked on projects on topics from the Mesolithic of Upper Deeside to 19th century rural settlements at Benahee. Public engagement is a big part of his research, and to date, 5 major exhibitions of the work of Northern Picts have been on display at the Tarbert Discovery Centre and King's Museum, Aberdeen. And Northern Picts research has featured on BBC 4's Digging for Britain, on Radio 4's In Our Time, and many other media avenues. And I suspect that aspects of that project will doubtless underpin Gordon's presentation to us tonight as he delivers his paper, Fortifying Rulership, the Emergence and Development of Pictish Power Centres in North East Scotland, 300 to 1000 AD. Gordon, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you very much for that fantastic introduction. So today I want to tell you about our Leverhulme funded project, Comparative Kingship, which we've been working on since 2017, and it's got a couple more years to go. So as Pete says, this is looking at early medieval kingdoms of Northern Britain and Ireland in particular. It's part of a Leverhulme Trust Leadership Award. And the principal aim is really to understand the long-term development of power and governance in these northern areas of Britain and in Ireland, looking at the character and orchestration of kingship in the first millennium AD, using a variety of different techniques and disciplinary foci. It's looking at 3 different case studies, one in Munster in Southern Ireland, Dalriada, which spanned the Irish Sea, and Pictland in the northeast. And it's mainly the Pictish research I'll be focusing on today. So it's got various different elements, this project. It's trying to bring together all the archaeological and historical evidence for these different case studies. It's got Nick Evans, the historian, on board to look at the historical documentary side. And James O'Driscoll is our project manager looking at the Irish archaeological material and working on all the case studies in Scotland as well. Looking at the forms of rulership and comparing the archaeological records of Ireland and Scotland in its wider international context. We're also undertaking excavations, or should be undertaking excavations, at various power centres. We've been working away in Scotland at Riney and Burghead for a number of years now. Last year was meant to be our big launch year in Ireland, but certain things got in the way of that. So hopefully we can begin work at our Irish case studies, Cashel and Dunnicaer, and a concerted effort from this summer onwards, hopefully, fingers crossed. We're also looking at the environmental impact or basis of these early forms of kingship and kingdoms, and we have been forging ahead with various publications on that, which you can check out yourselves in the whole scene in environmental archaeology. As well as doing new fieldwork and creating new data sets, we're also undertaking a lot of archive research, trying to date some of these sites on a more concerted level, on a much more detailed level, taking advantage of all the new techniques of dating, Bayesian modeling, etc., that are available today. And I'll touch briefly upon some of our redating work today. But really, it's that kind of second work package I want to talk to you about today, the rise and fall of central places, and in particular, the importance of fortified centres in Pictland and northeast Scotland in the first millennium AD, from the late Roman period through to about 1000 AD. So if we're looking at a comparative perspective, we immediately encounter quite a problem, really, if we're trying to compare Ireland and Scotland, for example. So Ireland has got the best preserved early medieval landscape and site-based archaeology of any region, really, in Europe. So over 47,000 ring forts estimated in Ireland, incredibly dense settlement archaeology. Hundreds of these sites excavated and very well dated. If we come to Scotland, then it's an entirely different picture, where settlements are severely lacking. Literally, a handful of sites known in regions such as eastern Scotland and the lowlands, where modern forms of agriculture seem to have a huge impact on the preservation of early medieval settlement. There's over 1,000 hillforts in Scotland, but there's only about 27 of these with early medieval dates post 400 AD. So we're talking about an incredibly small data set, really. These are the ones with early medieval dates from Scotland. And very few of these with a high degree of certainty of dating, very few dates, many of them excavated in the 60s or 70s or prior to that, where radiocarbon was either not available or of low precision. Lots of enclosures known, but again, very few of these being dated to the early medieval period. And we have a real gap, really, between the early medieval hill forts in Scotland and the earlier Iron Age tradition. So again, dozens of sites, hundreds of sites dating to the Iron Age, but again, very few dating to that post-Roman period. So really, one of the big parts of our project, the Northern Picts project and the Comparative Kingship project, has been trying to increase the data set for Pictland in particular, close to home in terms of being close to University of Aberdeen. And this is a map of all the excavations, survey work, geophysical surveys that we've done over the last 8-9 years or so. So you can see we've been incredibly busy trying to date sites to this time period, and we've targeted a lot of hill forts because it's one of the site types that we know that we may well have a good chance of getting early medieval dates for. But even so, I would say maybe 1 in 10 of the forts that we excavate date to this time period. Again, most of the sites date to the Iron Age. So we're increasing the data set slowly, but still small numbers, really, compared to what we find in Ireland. But having said that, one obvious thing about that is just how rare enclosure and forts of the early medieval period are in Scotland. There's no way that we had tens of thousands of sites like the ring forts of early medieval Ireland. Clearly, fortifying a settlement was something that was quite rare and quite exclusive in Scotland. So although that comparison is not very, very favourable for Scotland, it's quite revealing in its own right in terms of showing that there is something about enclosure in Scotland that is much more exclusive and perhaps much more important in terms of signifying kingship and leadership in this time period. And that's also an interesting feature of the Scottish historical record for what we have, which makes much more frequent reference to hill forts and enclosed sites in the Irish annals and the other sources we have for northern Britain. And the other obvious thing in a comparative context is if we compare our known early medieval sites to Iron Age forts in Scotland, what we generally find, with one or two exceptions, which I'll come on to later, is that generally these were very small enclosures, much more focused perhaps on the immediate kin group, a lineage, rather than part of a tribal identity, or whatever you want to call that in the Iron Age, a larger social organization perhaps coming together to build a hill fort. Again, hill forts and enclosures seem to be much more exclusive and focused on a smaller number of people within this time period. In terms of the historic sources, what we also find, in contrast to Ireland, where we have perhaps as many as 180 different petty kingdoms, is that somehow an over-kingship of Pictland, for example, and of Dalriata seems to be a feature from the 7th century at the latest onwards. So there seems to be much more successful, large-scale kingship organizations emerging in this geography. And again, the fortified settlement seems to lie at the heart of this. The kind of success of these over-kingships in Scotland is clearly something that people like Chris Wickham finds quite surprising. So in his book, a fantastic book, Inheritance of Rome in 2009, he talks about the Picts really being a contrast, really, a kingdom that sometimes operated on a larger scale, and talking about certain Pictish kings like Angus in the 8th century, defeating lots of his enemies and creating a very wide-scale hegemony over various regions in northern Britain. And he says, how the Picts managed this with no visible infrastructure in one of the most unpromising terrains in Europe remains a mystery, but they at least show it was possible. So again, we're dealing with a very limited number of these elite centers, which again is something that is quite revealing in its own respect. We're also dealing with a very limited historical background. So despite this being sometimes called the early historic period, actually the number of sites that have references are tiny. So this is a number of what we might term elites, hill fort or enclosed sites based on archaeology and place names. And this is what we have from the historical records. You can see that it's very regionally biased, particularly in Pictland, to southern Pictish areas in terms of the sites we actually have references. And this is probably to do with distance away from the sources of the annals being compiled in Ireland and perhaps Iona. We also have a real embarrassment of riches or not, as the case may be, in terms of what do we actually know about these early medieval power centres. The fantastic pioneering work of Leslie Alcock and the like really put early medieval archaeology on the map, but in terms of the scale of archaeology was quite limited. Keyhole trenches really revealing very little in the way of actual internal settlement features of these sites, and that's again something we've been trying to remedy in our project. So this is the only, well, probably one of 2 or 3 houses we know from an early medieval fort, and that's at Clutcher Craig, which I'll come on to in a minute. So now to today's case study. So we're going to be looking at the Pictish kingdoms, which were really contemporaries of the Anglo-Saxons and occupied an area from roughly about the Firth of Forth up to probably the Northern Isles and the Western Isles, but certainly mainland Scotland in the north and east was the main Pictish territories. The Picts are first mentioned in late Roman sources as these troublesome groups that cause havoc north and south of the Roman frontier, involved in things like the Barbarian Conspiracy in AD 367, and go on to become these quite powerful kingdoms in northern Britain until the late 9th, early 10th century, when there seems to be some sort of political and social amalgamation with the kingdom of Dalriata in the west to create the kingdom of Alba, essentially the forerunner of Scotland. We know very little about political organization. We have a series of king lists, which is one of the only native documents from Pictland. And it talks about the Cruithne, the father of the Picts, and he has 7 sons, which is basically a claim to territory. So we have an idea of the different regions within Pictland. And Fortru seems to be the most important kingdom. The over-king came from Fortru, and that has been recently moved up into the Moray Firth area in the location of some of the forts I'll talk about today. So I want to guide you through a number of different sites that I've been working on over the last 5 years or more, 10 years perhaps, to really give you a flavour of the development of these fortified sites through time and how that maps onto perhaps different scales of rulership and how that rulership is transforming through time as we progress through the first millennium AD. So the first site I'm going to talk to you about is Dunnicaer, which is this tiny sea stack just off the east coast of Aberdeen, a place next to Dunnicaer Castle, which is quite a famous medieval castle in Scotland. And this seems to be one of the earliest examples of this kind of second generation of forts that seems to emerge in the late Roman period. Very unusual for forts to date to that time period, but this is one example of that. And the reason we were interested in the site was because it was the find spot of 5 different Pictish stones, or so-called Pictish stones, which have these abstract designs and representative designs, things like the fish and the crescent, double disc here. And they've always been thought to perhaps be early examples of the Pictish symbol tradition, which I'll go on to describe more later. This is the sea stack today, a very unpromising site in many ways. But the reason we went there was because the stones were recovered in the 19th century from the stack, and we wanted to understand what the stones were doing here and what this site represented. Basically, to cut a long story short, we think this is just a very small fragment of what was once a much larger promontory, and this was a promontory fort of the Pictish period. And what we found was part of a stone wall around one edge of the stack, which is thought to be the remains of a rampart, and it's from a rampart or a low stone wall that the stones were recovered from in the 19th century. We also found buildings inside, multiple buildings built one on top of each other, very densely packed settlement. And most of these houses very heavily disturbed by coastal erosion, falling off the edge of the cliff, basically. Here's an example of some of the hearths and floor layers here. And we also found evidence of people's everyday lives on the site, and that included things like quern stones, spindle whorls. But we also found evidence for contacts with the Roman world, which in Aberdeenshire, this far north, is quite unusual. So we've found pieces of Roman Samian, parts of incredibly unusual glass vessels with very few parallels across Britain in this time period. So these were well-connected people, probably elites, and they're also metalworking. We found evidence for burnishing stones here. But perhaps the most surprising aspect of the site was the date. So we kind of fully expected this to perhaps be 5th, 6th, 7th century in date. But all of the structures, the rampart and the fort seem to date from the 2nd century AD through to the 4th century AD. And the rampart and the stones, if they indeed came from that rampart, seemingly from a 3rd, 4th century AD phase, much earlier than perhaps we'd countenance for these stone carving tradition. So what was this site? Well, the most obvious thing that this site might be is involved in some of the raiding, the sea raiding on the Roman Empire in that later Roman context. And so this site is really emerging in exactly the time period in which the Picts are first mentioned in these late Roman sources. And really, this is the kind of site that becomes so key, so central to Pictish rulership in the later centuries. And it's of that later centuries that I'm going to move on to now, and this is to look at our work at Rhynie, which is today is a tiny village west of Aberdeen, about 40 minutes drive from Aberdeen. And it really describes a kind of site and a landscape that is in a whole together different scale to what we've just seen at Dunnicaer. This seems to have been a polyfocal centre, so lots of different fortified complexes within this one landscape, really describing a very complex organisation associated with Pictish elites in this kind of very latest, probably 4th century through to mid-6th century period. So the site is very interesting in lots of different levels. It's got this interesting place name, which means seems to mean come from the early Celtic word re for king, so a place associated with a great or a sacred king. And that place name seems to be very closely connected to this area of land south of the modern village, where this carved stone, the cross stain with the salmon and the Pictish beast stands. But this stone is only one of 8 stones known from this site, and you can see they're much more accomplished in their carving tradition than the stones from Dunnicaer. So this is the cross stain, which still stands in situ today. There's carving of a warrior, which came from the modern village, and other stones, including this fantastic one here, the Rhynie man, who's carrying this axe with his big pointy teeth. So an incredible corpus of these Pictish stones from Rhynie. And again, to kind of cut a long story short, what we've found over the last 10 years of excavation is that these stones, including the Rhynie man, the cross stain, comes from an elite enclosed settlement that dates to late 4th century through to the mid 6th century, and seems to relate to that place name. This portion of the land certainly does. And inside that complex was a series of buildings, big timber buildings, rectangular timber buildings, and the stones stood at the entranceway to this complex of buildings and enclosures. Defined in the early phase by ditches and presumably banks, and in a later phase by a really complex wooden palisade and post setting involving squared oak timbers and hundreds of timbers going in to build the outer enclosure. And nearby, right next to the modern village, was a contemporary cemetery where we found square barrows, big square enclosures that might be enclosures associated with major funerary ceremonies. And the warrior carving seems to be marking one of these burials in that 4th to mid 6th century context. So we find kind of warrior symbolism tied into the dead and the representation of the dead in this time period. And then from the enclosed settlement at the Crosstown itself, we've got this amazing finds assemblage, the first ever finds of late Roman amphora from the whole of Eastern Britain, minimum of 3 late Roman amphora vessels, African red slipware, and we've also got glass coming from a variety of different sources, from Mediterranean, Germanic glass probably coming from Anglo-Saxon England, and also Atlantic glass coming from Western France, and a whole range of metal objects, spindle whorls, locally made pottery, which is very unusual, and all these finds seem to come from a kind of late demolition activity. All the stuffs back into the outer ditch. And we've got a huge production assemblage as well. Hundreds of crucible shards, hundreds of mold fragments, slag and furnace bases, tools of metalworking, tongs, ingot molds for trading these metals, and also these kind of crucible stands with heavy residue in the back that might come from refining or enamel working there. And then the molds are for making things like huge penannular brooches. You can see the barrel-shaped pins here. These are the terminals of some of these big penannular brooches of the kind we find in things like the Norreys law hoard, hand pins, and all this material is from clearly stratified layers dating from, again, the kind of late 4th through to the mid 6th century, so all quite early, really. They're making small penannular brooches as well, more handpin molds, and one of the most impressive series of molds are for making little animal figurines. You can see here a hound, there might be bulls, wild boar here, and these are very similar to the kinds of animals you see carved on Pictish stones. So we're beginning to link material culture from the site to the actual representations on Pictish stones, which is really quite exciting. And then there's more unusual objects as well. There's this iron axe pin, for example, which is very similar to the axe that the Rhynie man himself carries, of very similar style to the axe hammer that was buried next to the king in the Sutton Hoo ship burial. And we've got that kind of, again, that kind of warrior symbolism as well on some of the stones here. So we've got a real kind of ideology of rulership developing at sites like Rhynie, I think, in the 5th and 6th century AD. And we've actually got bits of weaponry from the site. We've got an unused pommel cap for a sword, a little nice blade here. And one of the possible interpretations of these animal figurines is they're actually from helmets. So they're basically equipping warriors, perhaps, at this site here. And we've got over 50 radiocarbon dates for the site now, and it makes for a very boring plot. But basically, it's a site that starts in the late 4th century, around about 350 to 380 Cal AD, and ends by 560 AD. So we've got a very tight sequence of dates, and a site that probably endures for maybe a century, century and a half at most. So an amazing window into that kind of immediate post-Roman context. Little did we realize when we were excavating Rhynie that really we were only at the tip of the iceberg in terms of the early medieval archaeology of this landscape. So overlooking Rhynie is this amazing hill fort, Tapanoth. On the top is a vitrified Iron Age fort dating to 400 to 200 BC. But lower down the slopes, you can maybe just make out an outer wall here, which encloses about 16 hectares. So this is Scotland's second largest hill fort. And inside, there's hundreds of house platforms, which you can see on some of the early plans of the site, and also on our recent LiDAR and photogrammetry results. Our researcher, James O'Driscoll, put this image together. You can see the amazing number of platforms on the hill, perhaps as many as 800, we estimate, on the hill here. And this is a illustration created by James and Stuart Munro, showing all the different house platforms, and there's trackways linking these. So we excavated this site in 2019. It was one of the last things we did that year before all the fun and games of 2020. And we excavated the rampart and showed that this was perhaps carrying a palisade. And the rampart is about 1.5 kilometers in terms of its length, enclosing, as I say, around about 16, 17 hectares. And inside we excavated 2 of the house platforms, and we found multiple floor layers, multiple hearths, and again, an incredible density of settlement, it would seem. Metalworking on these platforms, Roman imports, which again is really unusual for Aberdeenshire. And perhaps most gobsmackingly of all was the radiocarbon dates that came back. So this has traditionally been seen as a late Bronze Age or early Iron Age hill fort. But we showed that the platform occupation starts probably in the 3rd century, and We've only excavated 2, but seems to go on into the 6th, maybe sneaking into the 7th century AD. And there's no doubt about the date of the palisade and the rampart, which is 5th, 6th century AD. So exactly contemporary with the settlement at the Crossdane down the lowlands. And then if that wasn't enough, there's a third site that also overlooks the valley on the opposite side called Cairnmore. And this is a ring fort, which is about 30, 40 meters across internally. And the architecture of this is quite gobsmacking as well. So it's got 2 stone banks or stone ramparts, and each of these banks is revetted by a row of timbers. So you're talking again about hundreds of big squared oak timbers, creating a timber and stone defense. And inside we found traces of a large building and buildings outside this enclosure as well. Incredible investment in labor. And again, the radiocarbon dates for this entirely overlap with what's going on at the Crossdane. So it seems to emerge in the probably the 4th century, and this site goes on a bit later, certainly into the 7th century AD. So really, how do we interpret all this? It's really quite unparalleled in terms of what we know from Pictland at this date, and indeed unusual at a British and Irish level. So at the Crossdane complex, we can see there's probably cult dimensions, perhaps represented by the Rhynie man and his axe, which has been argued to be a sacrificial axe for poleaxing cattle. We've got metalworking, we've got settlement, we've got lots of animal bone coming from the site. And really the character of that faunal cincture is very similar to other elite settlements that emerged in the 7th century onwards. It's very much got the character of an elite fortified settlement, but of a very different kind of character in this lowland setting from the 4th to the 6th century. So we've got these 3 different sites in contemporary occupation in the valley, and it really gives a flavour of what must have been, a multiple focus for elite activity within this landscape, a multifunctional central place complex of the kind of character you might find in Scandinavia, with evidence for residence, metalworking, cult and ritual, burial, defense on a large scale, huge investments in labor, feasting, importation of wine and perhaps oil amphora from the Mediterranean and from pottery from Western France. So really an incredible scale of activity going on in this landscape in that late Roman and immediate post-Roman context. So that's the kind of earlier part of the first millennium AD. And I want to kind of end by looking at what happens from the 7th century AD onwards. This is when the Pictish kingdoms are certainly Christianized, and we see again a kind of shift in the scale and character of these elite centers from the 7th century AD onwards. In particular, get much more obvious kind of shared characteristics between these different elite centers across both Pictland, but also across northern Britain this time period. So on the right here is Dunnicaer, for example, Clatchard Craig in Pictland, and Mither Tap in Aberdeenshire. So sites in both Dalriada and Pictland showing very similar hierarchies of space, these so-called nuclear forts, which seem to emerge probably from the 7th century AD onwards. And these are organized in a hierarchical manner with an upper citadel and lower terraces radiating away from that upper citadel. Don't have much time to talk about any of these in detail, but I just want to flash up one example, and this is where some of our redating work has really begun to shake things up in terms of having, again, different perspectives on some of these sites and the kind of boom and bust, really, of some of these elite centres in early medieval Eastern Scotland. So this is been a redating work at Clatchard Craig in Fife, which was a site that was dug in the 1930s and 1950s And sadly, the site completely destroyed by quarrying, completely destroyed by the 1970s. But rescue excavations, and probably the largest scale of excavations ever undertaken at a nuclear fort in Scotland until the recent, some of the recent work perhaps. And this is in Fife, and the excavation revealed a house inside or some sort of structure, metalworking assemblage, and multi-valet defences. And the original radiocarbon dates suggested activity perhaps maybe from the 6th century through to the 8th century or later. But again, that was perhaps simply due to the lack of precision in some of these early dating schemes. And Clatchar-Craig is one of the most complex of these nuclear style forts we have from early medieval Scotland, one of the largest. It's overlooking the Firth of Tay, not far from some of the later royal centres, places like Fortifying, and it's in a rich area of archaeology itself, including various pieces of early Christian sculpture from nearby. So this is the site. This is the excavation trenches undertaken in the 1950s. And this is what the site looks like today. This is the village of Newborough, and this is the unfortunate location of Clatchar-Craig today, completely destroyed by this quarrying. So like Tappanorth and Rhynie and Dunnicaer, it was enclosed by ramparts, this settlement, up to 4 meters wide, up to 2 meters high, surviving, reusing bits of Roman masonry from a nearby fort at Carpow. And these were timber-laced ramparts, and all of the inner ramparts showed clear evidence for destruction by fire. And again, it preserved one of the very few buildings we know from a fort of this kind, big central hearth and floor layers, describing a building maybe about 10 meters by 5 meters in extent, much smaller than kind of Anglo-Saxon halls you would get in a contemporary period, but still one of the largest buildings known in Pictland of this time period. And these were the early dates. You can see a big span from the 5th century through to the 8th century. And our redating project very much focused on trying to create sandwiches of dates, according to the stratigraphy, so we could actually Bayesian model and tie down the sequence. And tie down that sequence we did, and it was quite incredible, really, to see that the span of the site was perhaps only a couple of generations at most. So it seems to be built sometime in the late 6th century or early 7th century, and being destroyed by the end of the 7th century. So a very short lifespan for this fort. In its origins, it seems to be perhaps connected to Abernethy and some of the southern Pictish kings, perhaps, that ruled in the late 7th century. Broadly originating in the same time period as one of the major ecclesiastical establishments of southern Pictland at Abernethy. And its end seems to coincide with a period of Anglo-Saxon dominance over at least southern Pictland, with Bede, for example, recording that in the mid 600s, the Anglo-Saxon kings had control over southern Pictland, and heavily put down a Pictish uprising in the 670s, sorry, I should say, that really culminates in the Battle of Nectansmuir in AD 685, in which King Brude defeats King Egfrith of Northumbria in a major battle of its time period. And it looks like the fort is destroyed during that that Anglo-Saxon over kingship over the southern Picts. So one last site for you today, and we'll end with a bang. We're going to look at one of the most complex and really quite staggering Pictish sites known, and this is Burghead, and it's a promontory fort like Dunnicaer, but on an altogether different scale. So this is what the site looks like today, the modern village of Burghead, extending to the south. The remains of the fort, probably only about half of it remaining at the end of the promontory, with an upper citadel, which is where the buildings are, and the lower citadel on the left of the photograph here. And part of the reason we're doing such extensive excavations here, you can see at the bottom of the photograph, which is extensive coastal erosion again affecting the survival of the rampart of the upper citadel. Up until the early 19th century, this fort was almost entirely intact, but unfortunately, a huge part of the fort destroyed through the construction of the modern town. And this is a great quote from MacDonald's early excavation report in 1862, which talks about the cross ramparts being hurled into their ditches. This is at the landward side, and the many coins, battle axes, and spearheads then found were given to any English tourist who came that way. So all of you have a look in your granny's cupboards to see if there's any artifacts from Burghead. So during that destruction, there was some finds which give us great insights into the character of this fort. So Stuart, for example, in the mid-19th century records that there were at least 30 bull carvings from the site. Unfortunately, only 6 of these survive today, one in the British Museum next to the Sutton Hoo display, and fragments. Some of these are only fragments, unfortunately, today. And these seem to have come from near the entranceway into the upper citadel. There's also fragments of early Christian sculpture. So again, the Picts are Christian, fully Christian by the 7th century at the latest. And there's fragments of sculpture from Burghead, parts of a shrine or an altar or architectural fragment of some kind, a cross slab showing a warrior on the back, and other fragments coming from the fort. There's also an incredibly impressive well, which has got rock-cut steps down to it. And this was thought to be a Roman well when it was first discovered, because it's such impressive architecture inside, a rock-cut square basin inside. And this was built into the landward defences of the fort. And there's an amazing history of archaeological investigation at Burghead that stretches back to the 1860s, work of James MacDonald in particular. And these are some of his early drawings of the site, showing the scale of the ramparts. Ramparts about 8 meters thick and at least 6 meters high. And he showed timber lacing surviving in the fort. And then Hugh Young in the 1890s, some early photographs of his excavations, again showing the complexity of the defences. And this is one of my favourite photographs, showing his workmen in the background and on the top right there. And he found, Hugh Young and MacDonald found a good assemblage of animal bone, what looks like an ingot mould, an axe hammer, a spearhead. But it was really not until the 1960s that the actual date of the fort was fully established through the work of Alan Small that showed it was of the Pictish period. But again, his radiocarbon dates were higher error margins. So this is how the site survives today. You can see on the west end, we've got some remains of the ramparts, but even these are highly damaged. And there was a real perception that most of the interior of the fort was entirely trashed. And really our work has been going on since 2015, particularly from 2018 onwards as part of the Leverhulme project. And what we found is really exactly what the antiquarians found, and this incredible preservation in places of the ramparts and of the timber lacing. This is one of the first sections we dug up against the seaward rampart, and unfortunately that's the one that's actually falling into the sea today. So you can probably make out the timber lacing here, the burnt timbers. So the fort has been destroyed by fire, like Clatchard Craig. And this was our most recent section And the kind of wobbly edges are because it's so difficult to and unsafe to dig into these sands. We have to have scaffolding and boxing out in order to get down to the lower levels, which is about 3.5 meters down at this part of the site. And again, we're trying to record this rampart before it falls into the sea. And we've got dates from the Midland layers up against the rampart, 7th to 8th century in date. And then most excitingly, we've got a whole series of buildings from inside the fort. So this is one end of a building here, for example. You can see the wall and all the black layers are burnt deposits inside this building here, 9th century building in this case. And everywhere we've dug trenches, we found buildings, early medieval buildings. This is a sunken floor structure. Looks like it got a suspended timber floor. Buildings built up against the ramparts, again, quernstones, huge structures in the lower citadel. This might be one single building. That's something we're hoping to tease apart in the coming years. And as I say, every trench we dug, you can see that our trenches dug in red, we found one or multiple buildings within the trenches. So it implies an incredible density of settlement to this site, which is about 5 hectares in extent if you include the ramparts. So again, a real density of settlement going on here. Some nice finds. These are pierced coins of King Alfred, Anglo-Saxon coins from a floor layer of a building, 9th century. And we've got metalworking evidence, iron tools, bone pins, all sorts of nice finds. And we've also, again, been doing archive work. So James MacDonald mentioned the location of a cemetery outside the ramparts on the seaward end, which again has been lost to erosion. But we actually have a skull from one of the burials found by James MacDonald, preserved in the National Museum. And we've just dated that to the 8th or the 9th century AD, so contemporary with the fort. So we've got a cemetery outside the fort, and presumably the early church that seems to have been incorporated into the fort also had a cemetery. So multiple cemeteries within the site, we think. And so the early Christian sculpture, if you map that onto where it came from, it actually was found at the modern churchyard today, which is the same one marked on Roy's map in the 18th century, St. Aidan's, who's perhaps Aidan of Lindisfarne is one possibility here. So we seem to have an early Christian church actually built into this fort. So a real incredible complexity to this promontory fort on a large scale, multiple buildings, early church, multiple cemeteries, and incredible defences. And again, we've got a whole series of radiocarbon dates from the site that shows it probably emerges in the late 6th century, early 7th century, and seems to end in the 10th century. And it's exactly in that time period in which the Picts disappear from our references, and you get the creation of the Kingdom of Alba, perhaps in the face of Viking attacks from the north. And indeed, there's a Viking burial that comes from Burghead, built into the ramparts, that looks like it's late 9th or early 10th century in date, so seemingly from the end of that fort. So really, just to kind of sum all that up, it's been a broad sweep through the first millennium AD in Scotland. But we can see that hopefully that, that the fact that we have very few of these early medieval power centres from Scotland is quite revealing in many respects. This was an exclusive form of architecture that's seemingly very much associated with rulership and kingship in early medieval Scotland. And that rulership is very much materialized and enacted through the construction and use of these fortified centres. And that tradition, this kind of second generation of forts in Scotland, seems to emerge in that late Roman context, perhaps through the kind of militarization of local society with the empire on their doorstep, and the Picts involved in many of those raids in the 4th century that really helped undermine Roman rule within Britain. From the 5th and 6th century, we see a much more obvious language of kingship, warriorhood, and leadership really developing. And I think Rhynie really epitomizes that with its amazing sculptural repertoire of axe wielders and warrior figures. But what it also shows, I think, the archaeology of Rhynie is really that we've kind of had a very myopic focus on one kind of royal site in Scotland. We had no conception really that, you know, these 16, 17 hectare forts could date to this time period in Scotland, and it really opens our eyes to other potential parallels, yet unexplored parallels in Scotland. And then getting towards the later part of the 1st millennium AD, we see the emergence of things like nuclear hill forts from the 7th century AD onwards, and sites like Burghead, where we get these incredible density of rectangular buildings within a fort of that date, with multiple cemeteries, the Christian church seemingly integrated into the ideology and practice of rulership in this late 1st millennium AD context. And the destruction of sites like Burghead in the 10th century perhaps very much contributing to the demise of the Picts and the Pictish kingdoms. Okay, so I will leave it there. Make sure you follow us on Facebook and Twitter for updates. And thank you very much for listening to me today. Oh, and we have a book out, by the way. Shameless plug. The King of the North. Very reasonably priced, £15 or less. My publisher, our publisher, would not allow us to leave without plugging this book. Check it out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gordon. I think the plug was justified. It may well have been a sweeping summary, but my goodness, what a lot of issues in there. Thank you very much. I don't know whether we've got any questions coming in on the through the chat. We'll perhaps wait to see if Matt tells us if anything's coming in. But yeah, Ralston, yeah.
Yeah, that's a fantastic site. I know that Ian's working on it just now to get it published. It's not far from Burghead, so it's on that Murray coast, one of a series of promontory forts that seem to date from, well, at Portnocky, there's actually a Greencastle, there's both Iron Age and early medieval phases. It looks like the dates, again, Ian will correct us with the publication of the site, but it seems to date from the 7th to the 9th or 10th century AD, so it's in that later 1st millennium AD context. So it seems to be a smaller version of a site like Burghead. No sculpture known from that site, but clearly part of that kind of promontory fort tradition. And perhaps all these sites, I didn't have time to go into this today, but it seems very likely that things like the Pictish fleet, and we know that there's a fleet in Dalriata that could be called upon by the king. It seems very likely you've got the same thing in Pictland and maritime power. So sites like Burghead are probably integral to the kind of maritime networks and influence and power of these Pictish kingdoms.
Thanks, Gordon. Any more questions coming in, Matt? Okay.
Can you say that again, man? I didn't catch the start of it. Rhynie? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very intriguing. It's kind of quite a rapid rise, seemingly, of the Rhynie landscape in that kind of 4th century context, and the Crossdale complex abandoned, it would seem, in the mid 6th century. But Cairnmore and possibly Tappanoth, we've yet to fully establish that. Certainly Cairnmore goes on into 7th century. It looks like there is some sort of elite focus still in that later period in that valley, but certainly the main royal residence or complex or tribute center, whatever it is, seems to move elsewhere. And it's actually quite staggering that our start dates for Burghead is pretty much coincides with the end date for Rhynie. So Burghead is one of the potential locations in which that elite focus moves, but there's also sites like Mithertap, which again I didn't talk about today, which is a nuclear hillfort, probably only you can actually see it from Tappanoth, and that seems to be occupied in the 7th and 8th century. So that's perhaps another site that takes over that kind of regional focus of Rhynie. And places like Rhynie would have been presumably one of multiple elite centres in that time period, with the king moving perhaps between different residences at different times of the year in order to collect tribute and keep an eye on his the clients, as they are called in this time period.
All the best kings do, of course.
Yeah.
Matt, more questions?
Yep. Well, if you get yourself a copy of The King of the North, you'll find chapters on fortified settlements and the early church in northern Pictland, along with chapters on the dating of the symbol system and the broader background as well. So, yeah, it's all coming out in years to come. But The King of the North is really a kind of summary of what we've done over the first 5 years of the project, and that included work on early church sites, places like Kinedder, which seemed to be in contemporary occupation to Port Mahomet, which was the focus of Martin Carver's fantastic series of excavations in the 90s to early 2000s.
If ever incentive was needed to buy the book, eh? Okay, Matt, the next.
Markham or Argyll, was it? I don't know. Yeah, Argyll. Well, I would love to say yes. And just before lockdown last year, we were meant to be going off to investigate a Dun site on the west coast of Scotland in Argyll. And that was the last project that we did before lockdown, or was going to do, and had to cancel, and thought we'd be back there a few months later, but obviously that hasn't happened yet. So yeah, it's unfortunate. A lot of our work has really been severely curtailed, as many things have been. So we were hoping to do some field work, certainly, in the West and in Ireland. How much we're able to do that now remains to be seen. Depends how quickly things reopen again, and yeah, whether we can still program that into the project, but very much hoping so. But our focus is always going to be mainly on Pictland, because I think that's generally where the major problems in data have been, in terms of, we're trying to get the Northeast Scottish material up to speed of elsewhere to really begin to allow that comparative context in the first place. So yeah.
If any more, Matt? And I've got one as well. So if you do rattle your three off, and we call it a day.
Yes, yeah, it's kind of, it seems like we're obsessed with elites in Pictland. And that's kind of for good reason in some ways, because we have a real lack of data on everyday settlements, everyday farmsteads from this time period. There's been some great work done up in the uplands of Perthshire, places like Pitcairnmore and Lair and Glenshee, which have found longhouses dating from this time period. But in the lowlands, we have literally a handful of sites. You know, and that seems to be because they're building their structures out of turf and using things like crock frames, which in a lowland context just get completely ploughed away. So the likes of the buildings at Burghead, the only reason they're preserved is because they're under about a metre of sand below and 19th century development rubbish, essentially. And at Dunnicaer, they only survived really because of you know, such an isolated context. So we've had a real problem in addressing the kind of everyday settlements of Pictland. It's something we're again trying to remedy, finding more house plans from sites like Burghead and Dunnicaer, and also trying to date some of the Northern Isles material of this time period through archive resources, again, sites like Wag of Forth and the How in Orkney. So hopefully over the next few years we begin to see the fruits of that labour. But it is a very biased record towards elite settlements, and even then, you know, again, we're talking about a few dozen sites across Pictland, if that are known, and even less excavated. So even though we have increased the data set, you know, we're still eons and light years behind, you know, the archaeology of Anglo-Saxon England or early medieval Ireland. So more to come.
Okay, Matt.
Yep. So we know that the northern Picts seem to be Christianized from the late 6th century, and that's possibly a contributing factor to the abandonment of sites like the Crossdane complex, which seems very, very pagan in its character, and that seems to be abandoned around about 560, which is exactly the kind of decades that people like Columba are beginning to operate in northern Pictland. So we begin to see, as say, sites like Burghead become very much implicated in the Christian faith and the Christian representation of that faith. So we have these carved stones that have the Christian cross, but also, you know, representations of warriors on the back there. And the Picts seem to love Old Testament stories about, you know, King David, for example. So they're very much cherry picking at times elements of the Christian faith to really bolster their own image of what a king should be and the character of kings. But obviously that's a reciprocal relationship with the church also trying to influence the practices and character of kingship in that time period as well. So that's probably a whole other lecture to discuss that topic. So Clarkley Hill is up near Burghead. It's just a couple of kilometres outside Burghead. It's a bit earlier in date. It's a Roman Iron Age settlement of roundhouses, and it seems to be a community that's again very much connected to the Roman world. There's a couple of coin hoards from Clarkley Hill and from nearby Burnley as well. And so those sites seem to describe the kind of first couple of centuries of the first millennium AD, when again these kind of elite settlements are in contact with the Roman world. They're receiving goods from the Roman world. They're being bribed, perhaps. They're raiding the Roman world as well. So it's a really interesting background to the development of a site like Burghead. So again, it's really important to put these sites in their long-term context, which is what we're trying to do, kind of blurring the divides between Roman Iron Age and medieval archaeology at sites like Rhynie and Dunnicaer. So really taking that long-term perspective on this time period.
Okay, thanks, Gordon. Is that the final question that you have, Matt? Okay, one more then, and the one I've got will make the final one.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point. And that's the real contrast to Scotland. We do have the odd kind of smaller enclosure in Scotland, sites like Upper Gothans and Cairnmore and Maiden Castle. But again, these are, you know, tiny numbers, and there certainly was never the scale of that smaller enclosed settlement that you get in Ireland, where you have many ring forts in a single landscape. So I think it must be describing a different organization of society in the two regions, and a different materialization of that social hierarchy that's existing in the two locations, perhaps with more claims to elite activity and ability to enclosure settlement in Ireland than occurs in Pictland, where it very much seems to be you know, solely a royal or a very high elite focus. So these are the kind of questions and elements the project's trying to grapple with. I don't know if we'll definitely have answers to all these questions, but I think that's where the comparative context really comes out, in terms of actually allows you to compare the different formations of these societies. And even if you've got a different archaeological base, that in itself can be quite revealing in terms of what it means in terms of contemporary society.
Okay, then in that case, thank you, Gordon. The final question is one from Pete Wilson, who says that Pictish raiding is one of the standard events of late Roman archaeology in the north of the Roman province, but Roman authors are often loose in their use of identifications of peoples outside the empire. What do you think could be the material evidence for Pictish incursions? What might it look like in northern England?
Who is this Pete Wilson? Why I want to know. Great question. I have no idea, to be honest.
Excellent.
It's probably, I guess, the material coming back that is the most obvious indicators. But yeah, what would you get further south? I don't know. Have to think about that. There's nothing obviously that springs to mind. How common these events were is debatable. The kind of geographical reach, who knows? Yeah, it'd be fascinating to find some obviously Pictish material or late Roman Scottish material, but what would that be? I guess it's, you know, the kind of material culture of that time period is very much you know, a British and Irish tradition. Things like, you know, the spearheads and the like tend to be shared across Britain and Ireland anyway. So yeah, it'd be very difficult, I think, to pin down the archaeological signature of that. I guess we need to take these writers at face value, really, in terms of you know, the occurrence of these events, but yeah, archaeologically invisible perhaps in many cases. But good question, Pete, wherever you are.
Yeah, thank you. It's I didn't mean it to be the last and most difficult question. It just happened that way. So forgive me. I'll have a word with Pete later. So I think on that note, though, Gordon, it just leaves me to thank you for a fantastic presentation, some really interesting stuff. And I really do hope that you can get out into the field and get on with your field work, and particularly some of that comparative work in Ireland. And I mean, one of the things I would really like to hear more about is that throwaway line that you had in early doors about the environmental impacts of kingship. You know, I mean, all that timber and all that and so on, but that's not for now. But I really look forward to hearing more about the project as it progresses, and you know, a few years' time, we may well be seeing you back to give us an update on how things have progressed. So thank you very much indeed, and wish you well in snowbound Aberdeen. And with the future of your project. So thank you on behalf of the Institute.
Thank you.